on the 11th of November, 1918, there were roughly 2 million American soldiers in France. 3 out of every 4 infantrymen among them were carrying the same rifle, not the Springfield. Most people assume the Springfield because that is the rifle in the photographs and the films and the museum cases, and it is the one every American shooter can name. The rifle in the hands of the majority of the American Expeditionary Force was not designed in America, was not designed for the American cartridge, and was not designed for the American Army. It was British. It was designed at Enfield. It was built to replace the Lee Enfield, and Britain never adopted it. That rifle is the pattern 1914, and in American service, the model of 1917. And its story is the strangest thing in British small arms history, because it is the story of a rifle that failed at the only job it was ever meant to do, and then quietly went on to do 3 other jobs better than anything else available, including one that most people have never heard about at all. Here is the strange part. Britain designed this rifle because she had decided the Lee Enfield was finished. That is not a modern reinterpretation. It is what the War Office concluded, in writing, and acted on. They designed the replacement. They built the trials rifles. They chose the cartridge, and they were preparing to change the service rifle of the British Empire. And then the First World War started, and the whole thing became impossible in about a fortnight. What happened to it after that is the part nobody tells you. So, how does a rifle Britain designed and refused to issue end up in the hands of 3/4 of the American Army? And what did it do for Britain in the meantime that the Lee Enfield could not? Start where it starts, which is South Africa. We have talked on this channel about what happened to the British Army in the Boer War, but the short version of this is British soldiers with Lee Enfields met Boer farmers with Mausers, and the farmers had 2 advantages that the professionals did not. The first was the charger. A Boer could push 5 rounds into his Mauser with one movement of his thumb. A British soldier with a 10-round magazine was feeding cartridges into it one at a time, twice the capacity, and slower to fill. The second was reach. The Mausers were shooting accurately at ranges the British had not planned for, in the hands of men who had been shooting for the pot since they were children. Britain took 2 lessons out of that. The first produced the short magazine Lee Enfield of 1903, which could be charger loaded, and which is the rifle everybody pictures. That was the practical fix. The second lesson was much more serious. It was that the Lee Enfield's whole architecture, a rear-locking action built around a rimmed cartridge designed in 1888, was the wrong foundation to build the next 50 years on. The rear-locking bolt is fast, and it flexes slightly under pressure, which is fine for volume of fire and less good for pure accuracy. The rimmed case complicates every magazine it goes into, and the receiver has a split bridge that makes mounting a telescopic sight properly a genuine nuisance. So Britain set out to build something else. The result was the pattern 1913, and you should understand what an admission it was. It used a modified Mauser action, front-locking lugs, the German arrangement, because that is what South Africa had taught them. And it fired a new cartridge, the .276 Enfield, which was rimless, higher velocity, and flatter shooting than the .303. On paper, it was simply a better rifle firing a better round, and 1,257 of them were built for trials between 1912 and 1914. Britain, the country that had built the Lee Enfield, had designed a Mauser to replace it. And the cartridge deserves a moment of its own, because it was the most forward-looking thing in the whole project. The .276 Enfield was a 7mm bullet driven very fast, the same basic idea that armies would spend the rest of the century circling back to. A smaller, faster, flatter shooting round in place of a heavy slow one is not a 1913 idea in most people's heads. It is the argument that produced every intermediate cartridge since, and Britain got there first, in a rimless case, before the First World War. It also had problems that were entirely real. It burned hot enough to wear barrels quickly. It produced a great deal of muzzle flash, and the recoil was sharper than the .303. Those were solvable with time and development work. Time was the one thing that ran out. And then, in the summer of 1914, the entire idea collapsed, not because it was wrong, but because of arithmetic. Introducing a completely new rifle cartridge to an army that was about to expand tenfold in the middle of a European war is not a decision anybody makes. Every round in every store, every machine in every ammunition plant, every man's training was .303. The .276 died there, and it is worth saying that the trials rifles had also been running hot and wearing barrels quickly, so it was not purely a logistical decision. The compromise was obvious and immediate. Take the new rifle, rechamber it for the old cartridge, and build it anyway. That is the pattern 1914, and that is where the second problem appeared, and it is the one that sends this story across the Atlantic. Britain could not build it. Not would not. Could not. Every rifle-making machine in the country was already running at capacity, making Lee Enfields, and would be for the next 4 years. There was no spare industrial capacity in Britain to start a second service rifle from scratch. So the contracts went to America, and this is where the numbers get impressive. Winchester built 235,293 of them. Remington built 400,000 at Ilion, and a Remington subsidiary at Eddystone in Pennsylvania, a plant on the site of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, which had been building steam engines, built 600,000. 1,235,293 rifles. A British rifle in a British cartridge, built entirely in the United States for a country that was neutral for most of the period it was being made. Stop on Eddystone for a moment, because that plant is the largest single fact in this story, and nobody ever mentions it. Eddystone is a small place on the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, and the works there had been built to make locomotives. Steam engines. Enormous, slow, heavy engineering. And in the space of about a year, that site was turned over to producing a British infantry rifle, to British drawings and British tolerances, and it went on to build 600,000 of them, more than Winchester and Remington's own plant combined, and more rifles than most countries have ever made of anything. Think about what that required. American machinists who had never seen a Lee Enfield working to gauges shipped from England on a rifle in a caliber no American factory had tooled for a customer 3,000 miles away in the middle of a war their own country had not entered. And they did it well enough that the British Army was willing to send those rifles to the front. There is no monument to that. There is a receiver ring with the word Eddystone stamped on it, on rifles and cabinets all over the world, and that is the whole memorial. Now here's the part that almost nobody knows, and it is the best thing in this story. The P14 did not sit in a warehouse. Britain found a job for it that the Lee Enfield genuinely could not do. It became Britain's sniper rifle. Remember the design decisions: front-locking Mauser lugs and a solid flat-topped receiver bridge. That combination produces two things: better inherent accuracy than the SMLE, and a receiver you can actually mount a telescopic sight on properly, in line with the bore, without the offset bodges that Lee Enfield conversions required. So the P14 was fitted with telescopic sights and issued to snipers, and its principal combat use in the First World War was in that role, because it was more accurate than the standard British rifle. And there is a lovely detail inside that. Not all P14s were equal, and the Army knew it. The Winchester-made rifles were considered the best in quality, so those were the ones selected for conversion. They were marked with a W. The scopes were mostly Aldis. and later the whole family was renamed, so that the P14 sniper rifle became the rifle number 3. And it is worth understanding why the receiver bridge matters so much, because it sounds like a triviality, and it is not. On a Lee Enfield, the top of the receiver is split by the charger bridge, and the bolt runs through the middle of it. There is nowhere flat and solid to put a telescope directly over the bore. Every Lee Enfield sniper conversion therefore ends up with the scope offset to the left on a bracket, which means the sightline and the bore are not in the same vertical plane, which means the rifle shoots true at exactly one distance and progressively less true at every other. Armorers made it work. The number 4T later did very well with it, but it is a workaround. The P14's receiver has a solid flat top. You mount the telescope straight over the barrel where it belongs. That is the entire difference, and it is why the more accurate rifle was also the easier one to make into a sniping rifle. Sit with what that means. Britain designed a rifle to replace the Lee Enfield, was forced to abandon the plan, had it built by a foreign country, and then discovered that the thing she had rejected was better at the one job where accuracy mattered more than speed. The rifle Britain would not issue to her infantry was the rifle she gave to the men doing the most precise shooting of the war, and she kept using it in that role into the Second World War as well. And now, the fair question, which is why the infantry never got it, because the honest answer is that Britain was probably right. Put the two rifles side by side in a trench in 1916. The P14 is heavier. It is longer. Its magazine holds 5 rounds against the Lee Enfield's 10, and its Mauser pattern bolt has to be lifted through 90 degrees and pulled a longer distance, where the Enfield's turns down close to your hand and barely moves. Everything that makes the P14 a better rifle for one careful shot makes it a worse rifle for 20 quick ones. And in the fighting that actually happened, men at 150 yards, in mud, cold, exhausted, firing as fast as they could work the action, 20 quick ones is what the army wanted. The Lee Enfield was not kept out of sentiment or inertia. It was kept because for the specific job of arming an enormous conscript infantry, it was the better weapon. And the accuracy the P14 bought came at a price the infantry could not afford to pay. So the story is not that Britain was foolish. It is that Britain designed 2 rifles for 2 different problems and only had the industrial capacity to solve one of them at a time. Then, in 1917, America came in, and America had a problem that is easy to state. The Springfield was an excellent rifle, and there were not remotely enough of them, and Springfield Armory and Rock Island together could not build them fast enough for an army that was about to grow to millions. Meanwhile, 3 enormous American factories were tooled up, staffed, and running, building a rifle to a British contract that was winding down. The solution took about 5 minutes of thought. Keep the lines running and change the chamber from 303 to 3006. That is the model of 1917. Same rifle, American cartridge. And it went out in numbers the Springfield could not touch. By the armistice in November 1918, around 3/4 of the American Expeditionary Force in France were carrying it. Which brings us to the argument that has been running in American gun circles for a century. And I'm going to give you both sides of it honestly, because it is genuinely not settled. Sergeant Alvin York, the Medal of Honor action in the Argonne in October 1918 is one of the most famous small unit actions in American history, and the question is which rifle he had in his hands. The case for the M1917 is straightforward. His regiment was issued them when they arrived in France, and the official history of the 82nd Division states that he used one. The case for the Springfield comes from the York family. His son Andrew said his father was never comfortable with the M1917's rear aperture sight, the peep, and that he traded for a Springfield and carried that instead. I am not going to pretend to settle it. Both accounts come from serious sources, and they contradict each other. What I would say is that the disagreement itself is the interesting part, because it tells you that the M1917, for all that it was the majority rifle, was not the one American soldiers loved. It was heavier than the Springfield. Some found the ejector fragile, and that peep sight, which shooters today would tell you is objectively the better sighting system, was unfamiliar to men who had grown up with open sights on a hunting rifle. Be honest about the flaws, because this audience will be. It is a heavy rifle. It is long. The two-stage military trigger is not a target trigger. And it has the strangest feature of any service rifle of the era. The rear sight is graduated for a cartridge. It was no longer firing on the American version. And on the P14, the volley sights on the left side of the stock were an idea already 20 years out of date when they were fitted. Now, the ending, and it is the best full circle we have had on this channel. Between the wars, the American M1917s went into storage, hundreds of thousands of them, and then in 1940, Britain, having left most of her army's equipment in France, needed rifles for the Home Guard immediately, in any caliber, from anyone. And it is worth remembering exactly what that meant, because the Home Guard is a comic institution in British memory, and it should not be. In the summer of 1940, the British Army had come home from France without its equipment. What was left in the country to arm well over 1 million volunteers, men too old, too young, or in reserved occupations, was almost nothing. There were units drilling with shotguns, with pikes, with broom handles. That is not a joke somebody wrote for a sitcom. It was the actual situation. And the men standing in those lanes had every reason to believe that German troops were coming. So Britain bought and begged rifles from anywhere she could get them, in any caliber, from any source. And the Americans opened the warehouses. So the M1917 came to Britain. A rifle designed at Enfield, rejected by Britain, built in America, rechambered for an American cartridge, and then shipped back across the Atlantic to arm British civilians defending British villages against invasion. And because Britain now had two versions of the same rifle in the same country, the P14 in 303 and the M1917 in 3006, and because putting the wrong cartridge into the wrong one would be a catastrophe in the hands of a Home Guard section who had been issued a rifle that afternoon, somebody made a decision that is the most British thing in this entire story. They painted a red band around the butt. That is it. That is the solution. A stripe of red paint so that a middle-aged bank clerk with a rifle he had never seen before would not load the wrong ammunition into it. And if you go to a military affair this weekend, you will find M1917s with that red band still on them, 85 years later. And afterwards, the rifle did what everything else on this channel did. It got sold off cheap. Tens of thousands of P14s and M1917s went into the surplus flood of the 1950s and 60s, and a great many were sporterized, cut down, restocked. The volley sights and the ears around the foresight ground off because they were solid Mauser-type actions, and they were cheaper than a commercial hunting rifle. Which is exactly why there are men watching this who have one right now. There is a viewer of this channel who wrote, last week, that he still hunts in South Africa with an Eddystone P14 in 303. Another who has an Eddystone re-arsenaled and shooting 1 minute of angle at 100 yards. Another whose great uncle carried a P14 sniper rifle in Vietnam. That is a rifle designed in 1913 in a British drawing office to solve a problem Britain had in South Africa in 1899. It is still working. Step back and look at the shape of it. Britain loses an argument to farmers with Mausers, concludes her own famous rifle is built on the wrong foundation, and designs a Mauser to replace it with a better cartridge. The war she was preparing for arrives too early and kills the cartridge. Her own factories are too busy building the rifle she was trying to replace, so she has the replacement built abroad by a neutral country more than 1,000,000 times over. She then issues that rejected rifle to her snipers because it turns out to be the more accurate weapon. The neutral country joins the war, discovers it cannot arm itself fast enough, changes the chamber, and puts the British rifle into the hands of 3/4 of its army. And 22 years later, that same rifle comes back across the ocean with a red stripe painted round the butt, to be handed to British civilians expecting a German landing. The Lee Enfield survived because the timing was wrong for its replacement. And the replacement survived because the timing was wrong for everybody else. It is the only rifle I can think of that was a failure in its own country, a war winner in somebody else's, and a museum piece in both. So tell me below, if you own a P14 or an M1917, and going by the comments, a surprising number of you do, which is it? Which plant built it? And what is stamped on the receiver ring? Winchester, Remington, or Eddystone? And the one I most want, does anybody have one with the red band still on the butt? Because that is a rifle that crossed the Atlantic twice, and somebody's grandfather stood in a lane in Kent with it. We will see you in the next one.